Welcome to the power of telling your VISTA story. We are very excited to have you participating in this webinar, and we hope that you will enjoy the presentation. My name is Khadija Carr. I am a VISTA alum. I served from 2015 to 2016 in Silver Spring, Maryland with the Community Preservation and Development Corporation. Initially, after college, I thought that I might join the Peace Corps, where folks wouldn't speak the same language as me, let alone share my sick and twisted sense of humor. But when a college mentor mentioned AmeriCorps VISTA to me, I searched the AmeriCorps portal, and to my surprise, there was a project in my hometown of Silver Spring, Maryland, working with first-generation to college youth, a category that I myself was in, and I was very honored to be able to work with a similar group of folks in my hometown. And so Chris and I thought we might take on the 6-word challenge as well. And so my 6 words are: home is where the service is.
And hello everyone, my name is Chris Hawks. I am a Peace Corps, returned Peace Corps volunteer. I served from 2010 to 12 in a tiny village in Belize called Indian Church. I was a small business and organizational development volunteer. And for my 6 words, I would describe my national service experience as patience, enthusiasm, patience, humbling, patience, fulfilling. So yeah, I mean, I started off with, I felt I had a lot of patience even prior to my service, but even starting off with a long application process, I learned that it was going to take a lot. And enthusiasm, you know, that honeymoon stage, starting off. Patience again, as I learned the culture, learned the language, learned how people in my village did business. Humbling. This could be for a number of reasons, cultural, political, also being around such an entrepreneurial spirit within the village. Also starting off, you know, some of my ideas weren't, some of the ideas I thought may have been best suited for the needs of some of the businesses I was working with. Maybe were already tried in some scenarios, but couldn't work due to some of the cultural or political challenges there. So humbling for sure. Patience again, as I went back to the drawing board on some of those challenges. And fulfilling, as I took my patience, overcame some of the obstacles, and was able to assist. So yeah, those are my 6 words, my 6-word story. And Khadija and I are very happy to be here to share this presentation. We're in Washington, D.C. in VISTA headquarters. And we are going to, Khadija, do you want to kick it off with the objectives?
Sure thing. So now that we have introduced ourselves, and before we jump into the presentation, let's look at the objectives for the session today. So we hope that by the end of the webinar that you'll be able to define the key elements of a well-structured story, describe your AmeriCorps VISTA service in a concise and compelling way, and adapt your service story to different audiences and delivery methods as well. All right, Chris, let's get it going.
Definitely, definitely. So when we talk about stories, the power of your narrative can be harnessed for a variety of uses. Whether you're applying for a new job, pitching an idea to donors, or recruiting new volunteers maybe, your success in these endeavors depends on your ability to craft a compelling story. So in those situations, most people don't just come out and ask for things, or if they do, it may not be successful. Instead, they convey information in the form of a brief anecdote or story. Even a short 6-word memoir like the ones you wrote in the chat activity just before we got started, those are examples of stories. So we're first going to go and explore the why of telling your story. So telling your story can help spread the word about AmeriCorps VISTA, and it can help recruit the next generation of VISTA members. Here's an example of an advertisement for a virtual information session from a few years ago. We had 2 currently serving VISTA members attend the session, and they spoke about their experiences as VISTAs, their motivations for joining, and some of the biggest challenges and rewards they encountered during their service. And while prospective applicants do want to know the nuts and bolts about applying, what really motivates them to apply are the stories of service from the people doing the work. I can say personally, from my personal experience, it was stories from friends, acquaintances that led me to joining Peace Corps, hearing their stories firsthand. And the majority of our VISTA members learn about the program through alumni stories and testimonials as well. And on this slide, you can see a short story from VISTA alum, Aaron Salaturo. So telling your story, it can help with a job, whether you're building your resume bullets from your VAD, preparing your elevator pitch, or coming up with compelling examples for some job interview questions. Being able to reflect upon your service through storytelling will help with your career. It'll absolutely help with your resume, and how much may depend on the hiring official. Your VISTA service is going to help, though. So it's all but certain that in an interview you're going to be asked something like, "Oh, wow, AmeriCorps VISTA, how was that?" So that's going to be your chance. That's the soundbite. You want to use that as your chance to tell your story. And we believe here, with Aaron's example, also helps distinguish VISTA as a professional opportunity more than just a traditional volunteer experience. And telling your story helps you build a professional bio. At some point in your career, you will have to do this, even if it is a short statement such as Michaela Lafrac. For those of you who are in PR geeks, we were thrilled to learn that one of our local correspondents counts her VISTA experience as relevant enough in her career to mention in her short bio. The fact that she identifies with VISTA as opposed to her partner organization speaks volumes.
A few years ago, we redid our entire website, and we created all new marketing materials to go along with them. In the process of refreshing our print and digital properties, we were tasked with rethinking how we tell the VISTA story. How can we concisely capture the unique and diverse programming of AmeriCorps VISTA in a compelling way that would attract new volunteers? This is what we were tasked with. And so in that process, we had to do a lot of soul searching and, of course, some market research, hours of editing. But when we went back to the basics, to the legislation that defined our very early days, we had to reassess how we messaged ourselves in a modern era. So the blurb that you see on the slide is a part of our new branding and messaging language, which we feel really accurately tells the VISTA story. And to craft your own VISTA story, you may have to go through a similar process. Now, eventually, all of the hard work that we put in building out the narrative and the context of the VISTA program led us to be able to craft very short and succinct social media posts about the impact of our program. But of course, we did not arrive at this graphic overnight. Before we were able to come up with the short sound bites, we had to really focus on the larger story that we have to tell about AmeriCorps VISTA as a program. And the big difference in regards to your story is the way that you'll frame it. So it's much easier for someone to talk about a single individual or a narrative rather than a diverse program that spans over 50 years of history with nearly 8,000 volunteers participating annually. So don't worry, your job is a little bit simpler than ours here at VISTA headquarters. And we had, in our process, to distill AmeriCorps VISTA down to its essence and make some generalizations that you will not have to do. So in crafting your story, you can focus on one specific person, one specific event, or scenario that can serve as the overall example for your service experience. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to break down a compelling narrative in the next couple of slides. All right, so why exactly did we suggests that we focus on a longer story, a wider net. So when you have a longer story, you can break it down into smaller components for multiple uses. And in learning how to craft your longer story, you're setting yourself up to break it down to usable and smaller parts. Much like when you bake a pie, the effort to create the pie will give you a whole pie. Just like the effort needed to create your larger story, but you can break the pie down to smaller pieces to suit your needs, and of course, to share with others.
And the ability to tell a compelling service story starts with an engaging plot. So let's deconstruct the elements of a compelling story. And here's what the plot will include. You're going to start with some context. The context is the when and where that the story is taking place. Then we'll add some action. So basically action is what happened in the story. Next, the tension. So you're going to want to raise the stakes and think about where the tension is and how you can build on it, and be sure to be vulnerable. Following that is change. It's not really a story unless something fundamentally changes. The change might be internal, like perhaps a shift in perspective, not to go off on a tangent, but you could take the season 8 of Game of Thrones as an example where I personally, and some may disagree, thought that the big change that occurred, it would have made more sense if more time had been spent on the action and tension a little bit more for the build-up. So you want to make sure you spend enough time on each of these steps in order for everything to make sense within the plot, within the elements of a compelling story. And then finally, we go to closure. So do you deliver on your promise after setting up a central question? Have you ever listened to someone tell a story that kind of just goes on and on? That is a failure to deliver closure. Or maybe you heard someone tell a story and you just couldn't understand why. Like, what's the point? Why am I listening to this? Again, maybe there's just no closure in that story. So let's listen to a story from StoryCorps that Steve will set up.
I'm going to suggest when you're going through the academy. I'm going to suggest that everyone turn up their volume because we're going to play an audio clip. So just one moment, Steve, while everybody gets their volumes situated. All right, I think that's just enough time, Steve.
When you're going through the academy, they put out this little card, and they ask you on this, hey, whatever you're interested in, just put it down over there. Beekeeping, of course, I put that down. And the very first job, the sergeant comes right up to me, and I just look up, and I go, hey, Sarge. And he goes, bees? And I go, yeah, where? Harlem. And I go, cool. That was it. That was the first job I handled. Whenever I'm working a swarm, I hear nothing around me. I mean, you can have a jackhammer running down below. I wouldn't even hear it. I'm in the perfect world now. Actually, that's the only time I feel safe. I'm never scared, never afraid. So I think it's in my blood. My father was taught the art of beekeeping by my grandfather, but grown up, I wanted nothing to do with him. Then in 1977, springtime, my father looked at me and he goes, grab that chair, sit in front of the hive. I looked at him and I go, you're crazy. I'm not sitting in front over there. And he goes, just sit there. I want you to see what's going to happen. The sun was just coming up over the hill. Dawn was just breaking. Lo and behold, as soon as that sun hit that hive, they started flying out. Let me tell you, that was the alarm clock going off. And it was gorgeous. It was beautiful. And he goes, they know what to do. They have to work. And that's their job, to work until they die. And, I mean, that's what I do. I don't go on vacations. I see it as a waste of time because I'd rather work with them. And I look at them as my children, which I don't have any children, but I look at them as I took it upon myself to say, hey, I'm adopting, 27,000 kids right here, so I better be looking out for them. So I've learned from the bees patience, respect, and I guess work till you die.
So listening to the story on the beekeeper, you may have noticed some of those 5 elements we just talked about, the context, action, tension, change, and closure, in the short piece. So we'll listen to a couple. The context is provided in a subtle way. So he mentions the academy and sergeants, but we're not quite sure what type of unit he's with or where until he says Harlem. So he quietly framed the story in the first few sentences. The tension part and the change come in the experience he had when his father asked him to sit in front of a hive just as the sun was coming up. But how about closure? Did you notice how he shifted from the specifics to a much more broader view? He talks about what he learned from the bees and how he applies it in his life. He also bookends a phrase at the end of his story that was echoed by his father earlier. Okay, so again, we're going to play another audio clip. We're going to hear another story from StoryCorps. And this time, we really want you to listen carefully to hear those 5 elements. So again, we have the context, the action, tension, change, and closure. And afterwards, you'll have a chance to share your ideas. So let's put this audio clip up.
I was 15 years of age when I first started having my own private sit-ins. I guess I got tired of looking at signs that said whites only. So I would go into the 5 and dime store, sit at the whites only lunch counter, and whenever the police came, I sprinted out of the back door. My family had no idea. The only way they found out was from the newspapers. Like a reporter calls home, do you know your son in jail? And my parents became very proud of me, but they wished it would have been somebody else's child. I've done some crazy things, but you take chances when you're young. I call it youthful exuberance. I can remember having a sit-in at the lunch counter in Arlington, Virginia, and word spread throughout the neighborhood, and that's when they started gathering around this child. I'd say he was about 12, 13 years old. He took his finger and pointed to me like, get out, you aren't wanted here. I could only hope that as he got older, some of his attitudes regarding equality and equal rights changed. The last time I was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I was their guest on more than one occasion. So the white guards, told these inmates, we got a troublemaker here, gang. If you give him a hard time, you may get time off for good behavior. I think that was the time I was most frightened. Except a couple of the guys in there, they knew somehow who I was. And they told the guys, don't mess with him. That was my salvation. Today, when people read my name, they may not know who I am, and most likely they won't. I have 3 grandkids. They aren't the least bit interested. But anytime I pick up a historical publication, I feel as if a period or a comma in that book is my contribution.
All right. So now we'd like to hear from you in the chat. In the sit-in story we just heard, which of the storytelling elements were evident to you? In the chat, list any element you noticed and a short description of how it was included in the story. Please enter your ideas in the chat panel to the right of your slides and send your message to everyone. And if you're on a mobile device, locate the chat bubble icon to view the chat panel for mobile devices. So the context I'm seeing is discrimination. Keisha enjoyed the story, it seems. It was profound. The closure is the comma. Context, civil rights movement. Became obvious from the lunch counter, tension, going to jail, not knowing what to expect exactly. Being in jail for the last time. Speaking about being vulnerable. Sit-ins and actively fighting for rights without violence.
For the action, yeah, that's good.
A period or a comma represents my contribution to something larger. Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful line. That's probably my favorite part of that story.
Agreed.
Yeah, vulnerability is crucial. Yeah, excellent. So it's really nice to see all of these responses calling out the elements of the story that you really heard within that short soundbite. Okay, so we've seen the 5 elements of a compelling story in those 2 examples, and now let's see how to take this basic framework and build it out into a rich and memorable account by following a few tips. So we've learned about the major elements of a good story, and now we'll discuss some tips to make your story even better. So the first one is to limit main characters. People won't remember more than 3 named characters in a story. So if you were to think back to some of your earliest memories of stories, let's take Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, for example. Goldilocks is really the center of that story and experiencing those 3 bears, but had it have been 20 bears or maybe even 6 bears, we might not have been as keen on remembering some of those details. The second is to allow yourself to be vulnerable, right? You're trusting your audience with information that's about you. So when you're sharing that information, you want to make sure that you remain humble, personal, and intimate. I think that the previous story we heard about the sit-ins really framed that very well in a concise way, right? It was only about a 2-minute story, and we were able to get very deep and personal with Dion for that story. Third, use dialogue. Include dialogue in your story to help develop the characters and make it fun, right? So the first story about the beekeeper, he mentions things that his father said as a quote, right? Something to really get us to understand what kind of a person his father was or the impact that his dad had on him. And so those are some of the bits that using dialogue can help really flesh out when telling a good story. You'll also want to find a way to frame your story. Find the context of why you're telling the story, and this relates to what your story is really about. You'll also want to use your first and last line as bookends to satisfy your listener, similar to the beekeeping story.
And continuing on with a few more storytelling tips, we have used the rule of 3s. So this principle suggests that things that come in 3s are really inherently funnier, more satisfying, or more effective than other number groups. So, and you can, kind of how Khadija mentioned Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, but you also always hear, either jokes or proverbs or wise advice where a person asks, the first person A this and gets this response, person B this and gets this response, then goes to person C, and that's where either the joke or the punchline or the wise advice comes from that third person. Have perspective on the story. So there's no crying in storytelling, and if the story is still a bit too close to you, it's not ready for an outside audience. Now it might be ready for family members, close friends for sure, but in terms of a professional setting, not always going to be the right choice. Also, avoid jargon. So between VISTA, your organization, and your position, the potential for acronym use is super high. It will confuse or bore the heck out of your audience. We here at headquarters, or HQ, we certainly use our fair share of acronyms, and we have to really try to keep them to a minimum when speaking with outside audiences. So we have BMO, OSAT, VTU, VMSU, CNCS, which, by the way, CNCS is a great acronym for our agency because it's a mouthful to really say the Corporation for National and Community Service every time. I'll just say that. But seriously, you could have a great story and a great conclusion or punchline only to have it end in an acronym that your audience doesn't understand. And so, for example, and that's how my journey led me to CNCS. The other person looks at me like, was that the end? What is CNCS? What do you? And it just ruins everything. But yeah, then going on to keep it simple. So keep it simple, and from one perspective, say as an AmeriCorps VISTA member, you want to keep it from that perspective. For me, this is advice that I have to really constantly remind myself of when storytelling, where I've started out stories sounding like Grandpa Simpson going on, and just really lose the interest of my audience by trying to get every little detail, every correct name, backtracking, oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that this person was there as well. And it just kills the story before I even really get started. So, going back and correcting, backtracking, don't worry about that. Just keep it simple. And for your longest, most heartfelt story, keep it less than 5 minutes. For other storytelling purposes, you're going to cut this down to smaller chunks, but yeah, we would say 5-minute max. So, having those 8 tips, we're going to go back and listen to Dions' story again. And this time, keep an eye out for any of those 8 tips we just mentioned, and we'll backtrack to it after listening again.
I was 15 years of age when I first started having my own private sit-ins. I guess I got tired of looking at signs that said whites only. So I would go into the 5 and dime store, sit at the whites only lunch counter, and whenever the police came, I scooted out of the back door. My family had no idea. The only way they found out was from the newspapers. Like a reporter calls home, do you know your son's in jail? And my parents became very proud of me, but they wished it would have been somebody else's child. I've done some crazy things, but you take chances when you're young. I call it youthful exuberance. I can remember having a sit-in at the lunch counter in Arlington, Virginia, and word spread throughout the neighborhood, and that's when they started gathering around this child. I'd say he was about 12, 13 years old. He took his finger and pointed to me like, get out, you aren't wanted here. I could only hope that as he got older, some of his attitudes regarding equality and equal rights changed. The last time I was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I was their guest on more than one occasion. So the white guards, told the inmates, we got a troublemaker here, gang. If you give him a hard time, you may get time off for good behavior. I think that was the time I was most frightened. Except a couple of the guys in there, they knew somehow who I was. And they told the guys, don't mess with him. That was my salvation. Today, when people read my name, they may not know who I am, and most likely they won't. I have 3 grandkids. They aren't the least bit interested. But anytime I pick up a historical publication, I feel as if a period or a comma in that book is my contribution.
So now that you've heard Dions' story a second time, we want to ask which of the storytelling tips were evident. So we listed those tips up here. And if you could, let us know and how they were evident and how so. In the chat, list one of the tips in a short description of how it was included in the story. So yeah, it's similar to how Khadijah mentioned earlier. Please enter your ideas in the chat, and also as a reminder, if you're on a mobile device, you will find the chat feature at the bottom of the participant panel. So we'll give it a second and look for some answers coming in. We have all that, well, okay.
Nice. I also see dialogue, short comments from reporters and prison guards. He speaks matter-of-factly about his experience, which shows perspective.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He was scared, which is vulnerability.
Yeah.
And through exposure to racism, bravery to counteract it, family concern and support, able to tell the story with emotion without being too emotional. Exactly. No jargon was used, the characters, the boy who pointed the finger, parents, pretty simple language for folks to follow along to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Describing the setting, the era, and the counters.
Keeping the characters to a minimum.
Yeah, memorable dialogue between the guards and the other people in jail. Let's see, I'm sure there was a lot more to the story, but he kept it short and very powerful. Got the attention of the viewer.
These are great. Please keep them coming in. We'll give it another second or two. Looks like there are a few typing. And we can always come back. I believe it has all tips. I agree, Marie, that it does. So we saw many of the different tips at play, but we are going to move on to our next slide.
All right, moving on. So we've given you the elements of a good story and shown some compelling examples. Now, how exactly do we start this storytelling thing, huh? Let's explore this. Where exactly do we start? So the easiest way to frame your story is to start with a prompt or a question. Maybe your story starts with a conversation that you had with your family when you applied to the AmeriCorps VISTA program. Or perhaps it was about one memorable day you had at your VISTA service site. Maybe a good day, a bad day even. Or maybe it was something that motivated you to serve as an AmeriCorps VISTA member, or to go back to your service site after you thought you might not want to return because of a mistake you made or something someone said. But like Dions' story, you could also start with a conflict, right? And then illustrate your reaction to that conflict. There are many ways that you can frame the story, but starting by asking yourself some basic questions might be a really good way to get yourself in the storytelling mindset. In the end, it's important not to be afraid to promote yourself, because really no one else is able to do that for you. And in fact, your inability to tell your own story leaves others to be able to do that for you. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you are the owner of your own story. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about adapting to different platforms. We talked a bit about sharing stories verbally, but of course this is not the only way that we can share a story. So remember our chat prompt at the very beginning of the webinar, where we asked everyone to write about your service experience in no more than 6 words. That was a way to get you into the habit of thinking about the important themes or seeds of your story. And as you begin to draft your service story, you'll most likely start with an anecdote or a lesson learned as the focus for that story. As we mentioned before, keeping your story to under 5 minutes speaking time is really an ideal time frame, because the average person speaks about 125 to 150 words per minute, 500 words if you're me. So a 5-minute story translates to roughly 650 words. I know that we don't often think about speech in this way, about how many words we are saying at a time, but this is kind of to give us a general framing for how it's typically done, right? The average. So in terms of the length, this slide breaks down the average word length for different uses of your story as a guide, right? So not all people will want to start with a story told out loud, but it is helpful to keep the rules for verbal storytelling in mind as you adapt your story for other uses. And honing your verbal storytelling skills will give you the ability to more carefully edit and curate your story for other media, such as writing, video, and digital mediums as well. All right, so where exactly do I tell my story? Here at VISTA headquarters, our marketing, outreach, and recruitment unit always tries to promote the VISTA experience through the words of our members and alums. And because the VISTA program is as varied and diverse as the people who are serving in it, we know that the very best way to communicate the VISTA program is through the stories and lived experiences of the VISTA members themselves. So many people start online blogs on platforms such as Tumblr, Medium, and WordPress. And here is an example blog homepage on Tumblr. As a program, we definitely encourage you to share your thoughts and stories in a variety of places. But make sure that in doing this, that you keep in mind that as a VISTA member, you should always include a disclaimer on your webpage that the words that you're expressing do not represent the AmeriCorps VISTA program or the Corporation for National and Community Service. So of course you are free to keep your own blog as a VISTA member, but it's very important that you note that these blogs are public, and anything that's in violation of the Hatch Act for VISTA members or any inappropriate content could result in disciplinary action. For more information about the Hatch Act, there is a helpful links handout in the handouts to download panel that will include a bit more information on the Hatch Act once you click into that link.
And continuing on with some ideas of where to tell your VISTA story, we have a couple of examples of portfolio sites. We've seen some great examples of where VISTA members create their own professional portfolio sites on places like you see here, like Wix or Squarespace. So portfolio sites are a great place to house a collection of information about you. So this could be like your resume, project samples, and any multimedia you have created. And as with other web platforms, the need to tell your story comes in handy when developing the main page, that first page visited, and the real theme of your sites. There's also the community post or op-eds, which many of you have seen before, but as examples, you know, BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post both have options for you to write a community post or op-ed style posts. You can see the example from the BuzzFeed's community section right here. This feature is available to anyone who creates an account with BuzzFeed, and HuffPost has a very similar feature to get your story out there. And of course, social media. Here are a couple of examples right here of quote graphics from a sponsoring organization. So we really love to see the nonprofits and VISTA sponsors. We hope they share quote graphics about their experience or why folks chose to serve. These acts sort of is a mini testimonial about VISTA, which in turn helps inspire others to apply and or serve their nation. Also, of course, there's Facebook and Instagram to share your experiences, which we would certainly encourage. I have heard of some VISTA members creating a unique Instagram account just for their service. So it's a great way to photo document those days. CNCS also has a Snapchat account here, and we welcome quote member takeovers, unquote. So those member takeovers are for a day, and if you want to expose our large audience to your project, we would certainly encourage it. You can always email us in our marketing team at vistaoutreach@cns.gov, and we will also put that email address in the text in the chat. And so if you email that to us, we will guide the process on those member takeovers.
All right, let's go on to LinkedIn. So beyond using LinkedIn as a great place to connect for potential employment opportunities, you can of course also use this as a platform to write articles related to the work that you do and your VISTA service. So as you can see on the slide, the example from Preston Chan, Preston is sharing his story on LinkedIn, and this is actually quite strategic because he made it about his professional journey through AmeriCorps VISTA and how he even turned down a job at Apple to join VISTA. So sharing stories like this on a professional platform really makes you stand out to employers and is a really great use to LinkedIn that some of you might not be familiar with. Okay, so the obvious place to start your storytelling journey is to keep a journal documenting your experience. Of course, you could also have a blog to follow that up. You can also share an op-ed in your local newspaper regarding your service and connect with your college alumni office to do a feature on your experience in the alumni magazine. And sometimes these come in both online and print versions, so you'll want to check in with your alma mater to find out if both or one option is available. And of course, if you are into podcasts, you can start your own or get featured on one that's already existing. Feeling like you're a bit too busy to do any of the things that we've just mentioned? Hate journaling or writing anything down? You can try one of these time-saving apps. Evernote or 1 Second a Day and iMovie are actually really great ways to quickly upload and curate your own content. I think 1 Second a Day is the coolest one on this list because you can actually take a 1-second video every day for a year, and at the end of the year, you'll have nearly a 4-minute video chronicling your year. I love things that are time-lapse in that way, and so this could be a really cool way to capture your VISTA experience. We'd like to hear from you one more time. Where are you, or where are some of the places that you plan to tell your VISTA story, or where have you already been sharing these VISTA stories? Is it in an article, in an organizational newsletter, or a submission to your college alumni association? Do you blog? Do you have a podcast that's your own, or do you share one with another person? Tell us your ideas. Tell us where you hope to share the VISTA story, where you hope to continue your VISTA story. Post it in the chat, and let's compare where we share these stories.
Blog posts, social media, and civic and service groups from Kathy. Everywhere.
YouTube. Job applications. Totally. Job applications are absolutely storytelling. Very good response, Heather. To a future employer, exactly. In an upcoming end-of-service presentation. This is awesome. Nice. We've got some more details on some upcoming presentations that you might be interested in as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I see some folks are sharing things on LinkedIn.
Local news outlet for Mary. That's amazing.
Nice. So I see some folks haven't yet thought about talking to your alma mater, but you're interested in looking into it. Facebook. Sharing everywhere. My main job is community outreach, so if someone asks what I do, it almost always leads into VISTA. Nice. Social media, civic and service groups.
Job Corps campus in Arkansas.
Michigan Nonprofit Association blog. Awesome.
These are really cool.
Yeah, National Guard, reservemen. That's one I hadn't even thought of. Excellent. WordPress. Twitter, Facebook, interviews. Job Corps. I'm loving these responses.
Yeah.
This is really awesome. Keep them coming because I'm sure that your fellow Vistas will really love to take down any and all notes as to where they can tell their VISTA story next. I like the Instagram account idea, plus being featured on a podcast. Awesome. All right, so keep them coming, and we're going to carry on with our presentation.
I would just say it's awesome to see these responses, and like my Peace Corps service was only 9 years ago.
9 years.
I only communicated by email back to my friends and family like once a week, in part because of lack of resources, but it's not like I was sharing on many things or had podcasts. I probably had Facebook, but I wasn't using it.
So I think that whether you're just starting your VISTA service or nearing completion, you shouldn't wait to document your service as you experience it. And so you should really use one of the apps that we discussed or simply take a picture or a video. I kept a journal personally during my VISTA service, and every now and then I can flip through it and I'm reminded of some small details or a personal interaction that really shaped my experience, maybe something funny that one of my co-VISTAs said, and it's kind of nice to just have that as a memento, but also to keep me informed or remind me of what my experience entailed.
And also practice writing and performing your story. Writing an op-ed can sometimes be easier to do than crafting a 30-second elevator speech in reality. So try practicing with a friend or colleague. They'll understand. Just explain the situation. You're trying to perfect this to better improve yourself. They'll be willing to listen.
Sure. And if you've finished practicing with your friend or colleague and you're ready to take the show on the road, you can always sign up to be a VISTA ambassador, and we'll send you a free kit. The Handouts pod contains a helpful links document with more information on the VISTA ambassador program and other gems that we mentioned today.
And as mentioned earlier, you can always send us content to vistaoutreach@cns.gov. And if you just include a little bit about yourself and your project in the email, so we always love hearing stories from VISTAs and would love to highlight this great work that you all are doing for our country. So if you send that, again, it's to vistaoutreach@cns.gov. You'll have that chance for more exposure to get your story out there.
Excellent. So we really, really care about your feedback, and we want to know what you thought. So how can we improve this presentation for future VISTA members? What worked for you in this presentation and what didn't? Please take a few moments to complete the brief survey that we've got, and thanks so much in advance for sharing your feedback. To access the link for the survey, you can first highlight or select the link in the pod, and then click Browse To. Double-clicking it won't work, so make sure you're clicking Browse To. And for those of you who are on smartphones or tablets, the survey link pod will or may not work for you, but we will post the link to the chat as well. But while you're doing that, feel free to type in some questions to the Q&A pod so that we can better assist you in your storytelling endeavors. So I do see one here, and it's asking, what do you suggest for how to tell your VISTA story if it was a bad story? So this is a good question, and I think one that comes up often in any other sort of job situation. I think the first thing I would always say is to be honest, right? I don't think that any person or employer, for that matter, believes that any job or volunteer experience is wholly positive. But I do think that you should, in that honesty, limit the negativity. And I think in order to do that in a way that is most useful to you is to turn the negatives into positives, right? What is it that this particular bad experience or circumstance awakened within you, right? What did it teach you about how you work, how you would like to work with others, ways that you are able to overcome challenges? What exactly was the silver lining, if any? How did you really take that bad experience or moment and turn it into a valuable lesson for yourself? I also think it's important to highlight things about the experience that you enjoyed, right? Even within memories or job situations that are not necessarily as positive as we would have hoped. I hope that there's something about it that you can enjoy, that you would want to highlight.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Khadijah. I would add, depending on your audience, there's also, for those bad stories, there's sometimes the potential for humor to add to it, if possible or if appropriate. You know, I had to go through this, I had to go through that, and then you're just explaining the experience. There's opportunity for humor, but also, as Khadijah mentioned, you want to make sure the audience knows that steps were taken to try to overcome those challenges. Whether successful or not, at least demonstrate that you are making those steps, those attempts.
Certainly, and I think for me it sounds like a lot of what this question might be about is around expectation, right? So what exactly were you expecting from the VISTA project or the supervisor or maybe even your co-VISTAs or other colleagues at the office, and what exactly were you hoping for, and how are you able to shape this experience into something that you are able to achieve in the future, right? Let's see if there's any additional.
Just checking to see if any others have come in.
I see one, but I'm not able to view the full thing. Ashley Woods, would you mind putting your question into the chat box? I'm having trouble viewing the end part of it. Okay, so it seems like the question is, what are some good phrases or terms to use when describing service year challenges?
For challenges specifically, it's a good question. Particular phrases. Do you have one in mind, Khadijah? Might have. This is a question where I probably have to dig down and really do some research.
I think it for me it goes back to similar as the first question that was asked, in that you know, you're expressing what your expectations were and how the experience you received was different than that, and highlighting the things that you were hoping for instead. It would be similar to in a job interview when they ask you, what's your weakness? And instead of just saying, I don't show up on time, you might say, in the past I've had a hard time showing up at the designated time, and to compensate for that, I have set reminders. I have gone to my interview location a day in advance to track my what my transportation might look like or what the commute might look like, really just kind of reframing the bad into something that you are actively working on in order to make it so that you're not just negatively talking about the experience, but instead talking about how you yourself have used that as a learning lesson or something valuable from it. Let's see. Are you seeing any additional questions in the Q&A, Chris?
Looking through and having trouble viewing the second line.
So it says, how much of the VISTA story should someone include in their cover letter when applying for jobs? So in cover letters, I would typically only include a short anecdote or a detail that relates to the project, right? So if an element of my VISTA service was regarding social media and I'm applying to a job that's related to social media, then I would probably only include the details relevant to that position. I would never include more than is necessary for that job. And I would say similarly for the resume bullets, I would include or put at the top of the bullet list, which should be about 4 to 5 bullets, I would highlight those relevant details first and then mention the other things.
Yeah, I think in that question, it certainly just depend on the job that you're applying for, as Khadijah referenced.
Mm-hmm.
And we also recognize that some on this webinar, many VISTAs, some might have more experience on their resume versus others who may have less, not a ton of experience in bullet points. So those who have less, maybe you do have to kind of put a couple points more in your cover letter about your work experience, your professional development through VISTA.
Certainly. And this is actually a really good segue question, and it's how exactly do you explain that VISTA is a volunteer service opportunity while also clarifying that you get a real career experience? So this is a really great question. So yes, VISTAs are volunteers, but you do get relevant and real-life career experience. So what I would typically phrase it in how I would typically phrase it, sorry about my jumbled words at this moment, is it's similar to an internship in that you are at an organization for a year and you're working directly with them to enhance their mission. So by the time you leave, you will have made it easier for that organization or the next group of VISTAs to carry on that VISTA or that organization's mission. So you're working hands-on alongside that nonprofit or college or universities or local governments full-time employees and getting hands-on experience doing so. I think what sets you apart from them is that you're not an employee of that organization, but you are working alongside them. And so I always think it's worthwhile to, if you're trying, Stephanie, if I'm understanding correctly, to convey this message to someone, I would always frame it, it is a volunteer opportunity. It's about a 40-hour a week work week for a year. You're receiving hands-on nonprofit, often experience, and there are other perks to it that are a bit different than an employee might receive, like non-competitive eligibility, your education award, the living allowance, and certain details like that. But I definitely think that it's worth making a distinction that though it's not a full-time job per se, you are serving in the capacity of a full-time person. You're just not employed by that organization. So it is still really great hands-on career experience, you're just not employed by your host site is really the difference there. Would you say that is the
Yeah, and I think you touched on it, like when I have tried to explain it, it's when you touched on almost like an internship. That's something that almost everyone understands. It's just an easy way to relate it. And it's not an internship. We realize that, so we're not saying that. But in terms of the easiest way for someone to comprehend, they get that typical internship, some paid, some non-paid, but they're gaining experience at an organization for a temporary amount of time.
I'm seeing a lot of questions regarding how exactly to frame it, right? Because I know a lot of us that are commenting in the chat might be a part of an intermediary project. So you have a larger host organization with several projects of the same variety around the country. For example, my service was that way. So my project was through Points of Light Foundation, but I was serving at Community Preservation and Development Corporation, even though the intermediary or the host organization was Points of Light. So I personally didn't have any interaction with Points of Light Foundation. So when recording that or telling my story, I often spoke only about Community Preservation and Development Corporation, which is where I reported to every day. So that's the same thing I would advise for if you're writing this on a resume or something. I would typically write the organization that I'm most connected to, which in my case was my host site where I showed up every day. If you do find yourself in community, it might be more worthwhile to mention the larger organization of United Way versus your small host organization that might not have as much name recognition. But I think it really all depends on who you're telling the story to and how impactful whichever organization name might have the most weight in that conversation.
Looks like a question here. How would you convince someone that being an AmeriCorps VISTA is a good experience, especially if they have a negative connotation about the idea of performing service? So the first thing that would pop out to me here is the fact that VISTA really is fighting poverty. So if that should be the first thing you should bring up. I served as an AmeriCorps VISTA volunteer to help tackle poverty in our nation. And if there's still a negative kind of connotation towards that, it might be a difficult person to convince. But if you get the ball rolling in that regard, you can convince them with numbers. Numbers always work. If you show what you did while at your site, whether it's recruiting volunteers, whether it's writing a grant. Hey, I wrote this, helped my organization to write this grant so we could fulfill all this task and this task and this task to help 1,000 members of our community. I think the numbers really stick out to people and can really show them how effective your service can be.
Mm-hmm. And I would say even aside from numbers, because I do think sometimes we get really caught up in kind of the quantitative aspects of service or of a story, really. I think the qualitative pieces are really what sell people. And if you're trying to convince someone you know, especially, or someone close to you, either by proximity or you live in the same town or you have a mutual friend, then really to share your experiences. What exactly led you to VISTA and what kept you coming back every day? Even through the sticky bits of service, you still made the choice to continue with service. Not everybody who joins VISTA is able to successfully end service. So what is it exactly about your unique experience that you would like other people to be able to share and to actually have their own experience with? Those are some of the things that I would certainly share. And I always think it's important to include benefits because something keeps you there aside from your passion, right? Like you have to be able to sustain yourself as a human, and we do provide the means for folks to do that. Of course, it's a bit challenging, and that's another part of your flexibility and your growth, but definitely include the benefits. The benefits that I love including the most are the Education Award, which increases every year. It's equal to whatever the amount of the Pell Grant is in that given year and continues to increase. Always mention the non-competitive eligibility. So once you complete service successfully, you are eligible for non-competitive eligibility, which puts you in a special hiring bracket. Essentially, you will be able to cut through some of that red tape and can sort of bypass a lot of the more bureaucratic steps that you might go through if you were to apply for a job directly through the USA Jobs federal government website. So, for example, the AmeriCorps Vista campus, if you've explored it, and I hope you have, has a Vista campus job board. And on that job board, federal agencies are actually able to post jobs seeking Vistas with non-competitive eligibility. And because of this status of NCE or non-competitive eligibility, those employers don't have to post that job on USA Jobs. So the pool of applicants is actually much smaller, and your chances of being offered an interview or even being selected for that job become that much higher because the applicant pool will be so much smaller. So I've only mentioned 2 of my favorite benefits, but there's a whole number that you can choose from that are unique and special to you in order to make that decision about which benefits and how to frame VISTA as the best AmeriCorps experience.
Looking through, I don't know.
We're looking to see if we have any more questions. Feel free to post your questions to the chat. It seems a bit easier to read. Apologize for that. In the same vein as the non-competitive eligibility, I'm seeing a question regarding how to include NCE when applying to a government job. So when you're applying to a government job, and this is a little bit of a tangent from the storytelling, but in your federal government resume, which is something you'll need to construct to apply for a federal job in most cases, you will be able to include that in your other section or in your cover letter, typically at the bottom, and you would just simply say, I am eligible or will be eligible for non-competitive eligibility on this date. And of course, if you get any questions about that, you should certainly advocate for yourself, and if you have to, educate the hiring manager on what non-competitive eligibility is so that you are able to use that awesome benefit. All right, so we will take a few more questions here. We're not seeing a ton that are relevant to storytelling, so if you have any, feel free to type them in to the chat. Are you seeing any more, Chris?
Not.
All right, we'll leave just a few more moments for questions. Oh, I do see one more here, and it says, when sharing on social media or blog, do you have tips for being vulnerable and honest about your service, both positive and challenging, that don't damage the relationship with the host site?
So I think it's important to, so is that for Devin? Yeah, when sharing on social media, tips for being vulnerable and honest about your service that don't damage. So yeah, there is kind of that fine line there, right? You don't want to be too negative if your host site is viewing that on your social media or blog. But I think there's a couple of different routes here. One, you could just bring something like this up to your supervisor and speak to him before, just beforehand. Hey, I have this blog, I have social media that I really do like to share my experiences as a VISTA to kind of spread the word, tell my story so that others can see what I've been going through this year, basically. And just kind of get a vibe to and speak with the supervisor to see what their feeling is beforehand. If you get the feeling that it's still a little iffy and that, you know, they're not going to like it if you're posting negative things, I personally would refrain from going that route just to avoid any kind of uncomfortableness within the organization going forward. But you can always keep certain things private. It could go, you don't have to share it with everyone, with your organization, the blog or whatnot, or if it gets into the gritty details, it can go more private than that through an email to close friends or just speaking with them.
Certainly, and I would say that if you think that the information that you're inclined to share might be a little sticky, then I would definitely leave it out. In some people's hiring practices, they will Google you or search you, and if they were to find a blog post of you talking negatively about your previous employer or a volunteer experience you had at a specific organization, maybe even similar to the organization you hope to acquire a job with, they might not be as inclined to take you on for those reasons. And so instead of highlighting all of the negative aspects, maybe just focusing on the fact that you really, after completing this year of service, are seeking a new challenge and one where XYZ, right? So if timeliness was an issue for your supervisor, maybe your supervisor was never on time and there wasn't really a steady set of things for you to do when you came in, you might frame it as, you know, while I wish I had a set schedule for my VISTA service, I was able to learn, you know, time management skills as a result of a very very flexible or non I'm blanking on the word that I'm wanting here, but basically that you wanted a new challenge and the service site wasn't providing aspects that you wanted, but these are the lessons you learned from that experience. So I would just say within reason, right? Like if you were to read the post that you were reading about a person versus an organization, would you want that person or organization to be something that you were a part of? If the answer is no, then maybe a blog isn't the appropriate medium for those challenges in that way, right? Somebody might ask you for a personal message to talk a bit more in depth about that experience, but maybe you leave that out of the general bucket of information on the blog itself.
Agreed. I think that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful, Devin. All right, so it looks like we do not have any more questions. So we're going to conclude this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We are super excited about this webinar. You all were a very participatory and engaged audience. So thanks again so much for attending this